25th May every single year is a day set aside to commemorate the founding of the Organization of African Unity, which is now the African Union, founded on the principles of economic liberty, but also the aspect of decolonization of Africa, where the founding principles of this are very prominent institution. Well, 60 years down the road, the African Union thinks it is prudent that we evaluate and fast-track the acceleration of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Well, to put all this into perspective, this afternoon is a panel of eminent and distinguished citizens of this country. That it's now my honor to introduce to you, and in no particular order, the CEO and lawyer of Kampala Analytica, a newly founded think tank here in Kampala, is Council Christopher Okidi. Council, thank you for spending the time.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to be on the chat show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How is Kampala Analytica? You had a successful...
Yeah, we had a successful launch, and I think the future is bright.
For you or for the citizens?
Yeah, for the...
And the country?
Because Kampala Analytica is for the global south, so we shouldn't also restrict it to...
Only
to the Ugandan context.
Well, thank you. The person who did interrogate Christopher Okidi is Professor Mwambucha Ndebesa, a professor of political science at political science and history. Political history at the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Makerere University. Professor, karibu.
Asante. Asante.
We are happy to have you.
Happy to meet you and happy to talk to the fellow Africans and other citizens of the world.
Yeah, we're happy to have you. The only lady on the show with a very amazing suit this afternoon is Dr. Sarah Birete. Doctor is the Executive Director at Center for Constitutional Governance here in Uganda. Doctor, thank you for spending the time.
Thank you, Moses, and good afternoon, viewers.
That's a fantastic suit.
She doesn't want to hide her poverty
because,
on this very big day, on the Africa Day.
Africa Day.
Yeah, but we are very happy to have you, Doctor. Our senior on the show this afternoon is retired Captain Francis Babu, who, for many reasons, we simply call him a historian and a historical and many things. Captain, thank you for spending the time.
Thank you very much. Nice day. Quite warm outside.
Yeah, it is.
It's African Day.
And somebody was talking about makeup a few minutes ago. I had to clean my face before I came in. I was sweating.
Africa Day.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
Professor of History, I don't know, how do we find ourselves 60 years down the road? Basically, what's the history of the African Union? Just for the viewer who is what the lawyers call a unsuspecting member of society. Just what do you have to tell them?
Well, the history of Africa can consume, I don't know how many volumes of books, but in a nutshell, I would want to use the words of one-time British Prime Minister, Macmillan, I think, was the name. In 1960, he made a statement of all places in South Africa that Africa was undergoing a wind of change, that the wind of change was blowing over Africa. That means he was foreseeing that Africa was going to get independence. And so people should prepare for it. The South Africans, I'm told, they were not happy with that statement. Later on in 1980s, I don't know when exactly, Professor Karujire had a professorial inaugural lecture, which he titled, or it was a rhetorical question, has it been a wind of change or a change in the wind? So he was assessing what happened, what has happened since independence. So Macmillan talked about the wind of change, and this one talked about change in the wind. So has Africa undergone, has the wind blown over Africa, or Africa has had a mere change in the wind? So by and large, if you look at Africa 6 decades later, I think you'll find it is more of a change in the wind, not a wind of change. if I would divide Africa into different geographical zones, you have the Saharan Africa. Saharan Africa from Mauritania, I think up to Egypt. You are talking about Mauritania, Niger, Mali, Chad, part of Nigeria, maybe part of Burkina Faso, part of Sudan, that is Khartoum, Sudan. I mean, you can see the crisis in those countries at the level of crisis of governance, political crisis and instability. Now terrorists have inhabited that area. It is undergoing other challenges, human development challenges like food crisis, water crisis. Go to the Horn of Africa and you look at what is happening in Somalia, what is happening in Ethiopia, what is happening in Eritrea. Somehow maybe Djibouti could be struggling here and there. Go to the Great Lakes region now. The Great Lakes region with failed, fragile, weak states. South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, which ironically is not democratic. Since independence, we have had a genocide in Burundi, genocide in Rwanda, genocide in Darfur. If you go to Southern Africa, maybe it has done somehow well, but you still have political challenges and governance challenges and crisis in Zimbabwe. Currently in Mozambique, there are even a terrorist haven there. Even if you went to the forest zone of West Africa and you looked at countries like Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, you don't find, and how many military coups has Africa had since that time. So you don't find a window of change. Yes, there has been some changes. I mean, if you considered how many graduates were there in 1960 and 63 when OAU was founded, and today there are very many graduates, there are very many universities. But by and large, you have had such a questions when you are interrogating some of these regimes and their performance. People would say, but is there not something that has been done? Certainly something has been there. It is like saying that if the pass mark is 50% and you got 40%, you will still insist, but I got 40%. Don't you see? At least I performed and got 40%, but you are still below the pass mark, whether you got 40% or not. So when you look at Africa in terms of performance, in terms of what we expected, compared to Southeast Asia, for example, which more or less also had that window of change, you realize Southeast Asia has actually undergone some transformation. If you look at state formation there, their states are stronger, they have less state crisis, their economies have done very well, technologically they are ahead of us, economically of course they are almost in first world. So we are in Africa and Latin America, I think we have only had a change in the wind, not a wind of change, and we need to put up our socks. But the most important missing link in all this, in my opinion, has been the state. The colonialists left Africa with weak states. We inherited weak states. When we say Africa has got weak states, or has had weak states since that time, some people would say, no, but we are holding our territorial integrity, our borders are safeguarded, and we don't have wars in some other countries. That is not necessarily the strength of the state. The strength of the state is not determined by the hard power of the state. It is the soft power of the state. The hard power is using a coercive machinery of the state to keep people together. So most countries have kept people together, others have fallen apart, but that is not the point. The point is, can people keep together without being coerced? And that is where we missed. And we missed it almost immediately after independence. We had a crisis in Congo. 1 year into independence, Lumumba was killed. The country had civil wars in Katanga. Then we had a civil war in Biafra in Nigeria. Then we had a civil war in Somalia. We had very many civil wars followed by very many military coups and military coups after military coups. And then We had economic crisis. Then the IMF and World Bank came with structural adjustment programs, which made matters worse. So you find that the picture is not as expected. At independence in Uganda, there was a slogan that government was going to fight disease, poverty, and ignorance. That was the slogan, the goal at that time. But look at our education system. Yes, we have numbers, but in terms of quality, it is wanting. Africa is the one with crises of diseases. Malnutrition rates are still high, although we have made some inroads here and there. In terms of technological base, we have not gone very far. Africa is a dark continent in quotes, not a dark continent as the Wazungu wanted us to believe that we had civilized. No, dark in terms of the energy crisis. If you are traveling an aeroplane all over the world at night and you enter Africa, you can tell I have entered Africa even when you have not seen it on the screen, because that is where you'll find more darkness. You can't see light down there. So where did we go wrong? What is African exceptionalism is the question we should answer ourselves. My take, which is an opinion, is that we inherited weak states, and we have had these states. We need to work on states, make them stronger through software, soft power, not hard power, i.e. creating legitimate states in the hearts of the people, and these states will in turn address economic challenges, poverty challenges, and other challenges. That's what Southeast Asia has done. I'm not necessarily talking about democracy, by the way, because some countries have attained higher development growth without behind the curtain of authoritarianism. But those countries have strong states. Africa and Latin America have missed it out. They got independence and their states remained weak states. But when you tell our leaders who are supposed to create these strong states, they say, no, we are strong. After all, you can see we are holding the opposition down. We are keeping the country, the borders and all this. No, that's not necessarily the strength of the state. The strength of the state is software, soft power, whereby, for example, I'm giving the example as I conclude so that others can come in. If you look at Uganda now, it's not a failed state, of course, but it's a weak state. And I will give you why I think it is a weak state. Look at ghosts. The government is always, they are now carrying out even an exercise of public service head count. But they have done this one before. Head counts, you remain with ghosts. Ghost pensioners, ghost soldiers. Now I have had even their ghost health centers. A whole health center for can be a ghost of all places in Intungamo.
There are even ghost degrees now.
We have ghost degrees.
So that is one indicator of weak states. So we don't know our population. Tax correction. Let me give you another example of tax correction. Like Uganda Revenue Authority corrects about 13% of ratio of GDP. But you find in some OECD countries, they correct 34% of their GDP. But even the little we correct here, we concentrate on very few people. You find the taxpayers who contribute are about 1 million. The rest are not contributing. And you don't know who is supposed to pay what and who is not supposed to pay what. That is the weakness of the state. But the challenge of Africa has remained. Definitely we have made some steps forward. But I think those steps is what Professor Karujire called a change in the wind, not a wind of change in Africa.
Fair enough, Professor. Mr. CEO, Chris, let me just bring you in. And as you cast for us light into particularly Africa's decolonization struggles and history. But also, Prof did mention something about state reforms. And I think I've heard you before make an argument in the same line. Whether Uganda or Africa needs state reforms rather than maybe constitutional reforms. But I'll give you a chance to give us your own context regarding the history of Africa's decolonization and our struggles against tyranny and all these things.
I first of all want to agree with Prof. The context he has given. But then also, when we are to place it within the theme and the discussion we are having currently about Africa Liberation Day. In fact, when I was actually coming to the studio, I was actually saying that I think this is one of the biggest ironies, Africa Liberation Day, because Africa has never been liberated. Africa has never been liberated. Why? Because even at independence, you know leaders who struggled for independence in Africa. Some of them closed door in Kenya saying, not yet Uhuru, meaning there was actually no liberation. Because even when we are to talk about, even when we are to say that for the case of Uganda, the lowering of the Union Jack and replacing it with the Ugandan flag, that I think what only changed is the symbolism of state, that now you have a different flag. But then in terms of oppression, I think oppression remains. And when you talk about, when Prof talked about the context of civil wars, it was not the imperialists who were actually fighting. So what actually meant is that Africa merely, independence, or what we talk about decolonization, just ushered in new faces. The oppressor changed from a white oppressor to a black oppressor. And I think that is also something that we also need to put, to factor it in. But then also when we are to look at, if we are to look at currently, and when you talk about issues of state, Africa was supposed to seize that opportunity of independence to, one, further their own economic development, two, unite the continent, and then try to repair the missed opportunities that colonialism had actually brought on the continent. But what did they do? In 1998, when Mwalimu Julius Nyerere was delivering the Kwame Nkrumah lecture, he said when they met at the All Africa Conference to talk about African unity, and of course, Kwame Nkrumah convened them, what were other leaders thinking? He said there are very many, some leader came to mobilize him saying that, Nyerere, how then do I go back to my country and convince my people that I came here as president, and now I have come back not as president, because we have formed one single entity called an African government. So at the end of it all, the biggest actor, or the biggest stumbling block, or the biggest problem in Africa are the Africans themselves, because they failed to seize the moment of independence and continued to fight among themselves, jostle over power, jostle over resources, because independence followed immediately with a spate of civil wars that happened across the whole continent that he has been enumerating.
Followed by military coups.
Yes, followed by military coups across the entire continent that he aptly enumerated. So when you're talking about decolonization, so I think a decolonization never happened in Africa. What happened in Africa is that the people the compradors, if we are to use Marxist rhetoric, the compradors who benefited from the colonial regime placed themselves, agitated so that they replace the colonialists in terms of oppressing their own citizenry. Because even if you're to look at all these Kwame Nkrumahs, they went and studied at Edinburgh. Who took them to study at Edinburgh? It is the same colonialists. And by the way, I think we also over-romanticize the fact that there were African nationalists who liberated the continent. I think it is too much romanticism, because These people were first of all prepared, deliberately prepared to take over. In the case of Uganda, when we went to Lancaster, it was clearly stated to Benedicto Chiwanuka, who was then chief minister, and everyone else expected that he should definitely be the one to take over the reins of power when the British left. But because he was not their sycophant, he was not their comprador, you see, they immediately said, you know, we cannot leave power to a Catholic. And by the way, a senior British official clearly made it very clear to the DP delegation that, you see, we are going to leave power, but we cannot leave this power to Catholics, you see. So that is why I say we even over-romanticize this. In fact, by over-romanticizing it, we have given them a license to continue to oppress Africa. When Nkrumah, for example, took over the reins of Ghana, just after 7 years, and it is aptly put in the book of Aikwe Ama, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, where he gives the symbolism of Aboliga the frog. And he says that in just 7 years, Ghana under Nkrumah had already matured into a full despotic regime and government. And these are the people we call the fathers of Africa. These are people we call in Ghana, they call them the father of the nations. Where is his political party, the CPP, right now? The mere fact that his political organization, the CPP, has failed to even live up to this particular time is an indictment of their true intention for the state. So I think we should avoid over-romanticizing the role of the so-called African nationalists. Because even when we talk about the decolonization struggle, we know that the Africa was not decolonized by their agitation. Their agitation was secondary to the agenda. There was just a total rise in global consciousness of the demand for a free world. That colonialism was now untenable in the new global consciousness that was emerging, which we eventually saw it through the San Francisco spirit that let people be free, you see? And even in the British Parliament, for me, actually, if I am to talk about the people who liberated Africa, I would credit people like Wilberforce, who was a white man in their parliament talking against the colonization of the people of Africa. So because we have overly romanticized this, we have even created a whole ideology called Pan-Africanism.
So Chris,
which,
now this is where I ask you, where do you put now the likes of the Pataka movement, the guys who really, go to the streets and said, we are tired of all this? Is it fair to discredit the efforts of Africans who were very active at the time?
But who talks about them? Who talks about them? All our history does is to romanticize the Red Sibas, the Milton Obotes, the Jolly George Wanukas, the Abubakar Mayanja. But who talks about the founders of the Bataka movement?
But
because we know
Musazi is talked about.
Ignatius Musazi.
Yes,
yeah,
Musazi.
Of course, I know Ignatius Musazi was in the Farmers Union. But other than people like Ignatius Musazi, but you see, you can even see the trajectory of their career. Where did their career anyway end? Wasn't the UNC disbanded? Because the UNC split. Because one, they were not a comprador political organization, but it was rising basically because of the legitimate discontent of the people, the Bataka movement. But now, why did it therefore split? It is what Sun Tzu, in his Art of War, calls a fifth column. You create a fifth column within a political entity, disorganize it if it doesn't serve your purpose. But why did other political organizations, like, for example, the UPU thrive, the UPC thrive? You see, it is because their agenda was somehow aligned with the agenda of the metropole. So so that is why actually, in fact, I don't want us to lose that point of the Bataka movement, because that is very essential. You need to know that the Bataka movement, and that was a group that actually came up against the collision between the Mengo elite
Mengo, yes, and
and the colonial elite. You see? So that was an organic offshoot of a struggle. And I think I would also put the Montgomery, what we call the Munana.
Majimai, oh, sorry, Mau Mau.
It's called
No.
Namba Munana.
Munana. That is the, in fact, for me, that is
1948.
yes, the 19. In fact, that is the lead, because these are people who went. They were part of that Montgomery battalion. They saw the white man being scattered in conflict, and so they also gained some kind of confidence and strength to take on the white man here. So if you're talking or looking at the decolonization of Africa, if you're going to look at the decolonization of Africa, you may actually have to take the players and the main actors you think are the people who liberated Africa on case-by-case basis. But lumping them together creates some kind of
A facade.
Yeah, it creates a facade. It is like we are worshipping Baal. You know, it is like we are worshipping Baal.
Fair enough.
And then we even conjure up. That is how President Museveni and his cohorts have managed to appropriate Pan-Africanism, misuse it, and say we are actually still continuing with the agenda of African liberation, even when Uganda is not in any way liberated. Because we know who calls the shots. Look at the Uganda's economy. The biggest stakeholders in Uganda's economy up to now are the British. You may need to know that. The people who run your central bank, and Dr. Suruma wrote about it, are actually the Bretton Woods and still the Western economies. So is that independence?
Good question.
Is that decolonization?
Good question.
Yes.
Good question. Sarah, I have to bring you in. I have to borrow the argument of Chris. Chris says that the African liberators somehow at some point turned to become the oppressors of their own people. And I'm a bit persuaded, because if you look at Tanzania, you look at Chama cha Mapinduzi, founded by Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, is still the party in power. Frelimo, the party founded by Moses Samora Machel, is still the party in power. You look at Angola, the party founded by Jonas Savimbi is still the party in power. So I don't know how.
What's Savimbi?
Jonas Savimbi, Angola.
It's not the one. It
You're
was
talking about
Yeah.
Agostino Neto?
Agostino Neto and then Dos Santos.
Yes, but the point that I don't want us to lose is that I don't know, have we swayed off the path? Have African leaders who came in as, liberators of their people somehow lost the path, and that's why Africa has never seemed to take off?
I thought you wanted
know,
to ask
I think
about
for
the
me-
constitutional crisis in Africa since independence.
No. I think we can. I think to be fair to our pre-independence and immediate post-independence leaders, Africans fought for independence. The British and other colonizers never wanted to freely give away the cheap labor, the vast raw materials, and all the issues they were dealing in. When you look at you can look at many countries, including South Africa, which was, late liberated, and Zimbabwe, the white settlers in Zimbabwe. You can look at the white
Southern Rhodesia.
settlers in Kenya. It was never to say that the Nkrumah and they could have messed up after, but the move for independence was a move by nationalists in Africa and the diaspora, mainly led by students who then came in like the likes of Nkrumah. But it's not that it was the intention of the British. I want to distinguish myself from that. The question is, what happened after independence? I've just returned from Ghana, I think 2 weeks ago. And I want to use that example, especially where we need to give credit to our heroes. If you look at Ghana's economy, I know they are facing turbulence. They've just signed a $3 billion bailout with IMF. But if you look at Ghana's economy, the shops, what they wear, what they consume. I know there is a rhetoric of Africa does not consume what they produce, but Ghana consumes what they produce to like 80% extent, including clothing, including shoes, including all their markets are full of locally made things. And I was in the upscale side of Accra. So I was really amazed that, you know, the decolonization of the mind and the soul that happened in Ghana. I see Captain Babu laughing. I know that the economy has gone up in
No,
frames.
I worked there, that's why.
Yes, because of overborrowing. But do you see the products? So because of the overborrowing and the reliance on oil plus corruption, the economy has gone up in flames. But if you look at what are items that the Ghanaian people consume, you will not, I know you are saying I'm wearing a nice suit, but you will not find a Ghanaian person wearing this kind. There are very few wearing this kind of clothes. They wear their own clothes. They have very beautiful shoes. You can compare them with the Nike shoes. So I was really amazed at what people can produce locally. Majority of goods in their shops, majority of goods in their markets. That shows that their economy based on production, if it wasn't for the mess in the leadership and the over reliance on oil to overborrow and then inflation, they would no wonder it was once referred as a success story for Africa. So that is the kind of question we need to interrogate. What happened after independence? But to the question of independence and national heroes, let's give them some credit. Look at the likes of Patrice Lumumba and DRC. The struggles they underwent. You can say today that Chama cha Mapinduzi is a distortion of what Nyerere had intended. But also Mwalimu Nyerere was not perfect. They are not perfect people. But what were the intentions? Look at Mwalimu Nyerere delaying the independence of Tanzania so that Uganda and Kenya are liberated. And then, you know, the intentions of the actions of the leaders. We need to give them some credit. There were challenges when they assumed power after attaining political independence. What happened to the economic and social independence of the African people? To me, that's where the leadership lost it. And that's why I was bringing in the example of those, the economic, domestically produced goods in Ghana. I've not visited any African country other than Ghana. And I've been to majority of African countries, above 48 countries. I've not seen an economy where people consume what they produce like Ghana. I've not. So where did we go wrong should be the question. Other than crucifying the likes of Mzee Jomo Kenyatta, Jaramogi, Jimbo Dinga, and the rest of the struggles they were fighting. Were they fighting air?
I think we know where we went wrong. We don't know why we went wrong.
Yes, that's all. I just want to demystify.
I want to interest you to read.
No.
Read Ngugi
Chris, let
Wathongo's
me first
Mercedes-Benz funeral.
Let me first submit.
Understand post-independence politics.
Yes, I'm saying, so we are discussing the build-up to independence. Were these national heroes or they were fakes that we romanticize? That's the issue I'm addressing. As to what happened when we attained political independence, it is where Africa went wrong. After achieving political independence, Nkrumah was overthrown twice, trying to deal with issues of Zimbabwe and another country. On 2 times he was out of the country, overthrown by the British, who never wanted, of course, to voluntarily surrender. I see Captain Babu wants to come in. So let's give them that credit.
I'm enjoying that.
Let's give them that credit for that struggle. It was not stage managed. It was a real struggle for independence. At times we feel that Uganda, because after independence, we've been in a cycle of conflict after conflict. Our politics really went hayway, never achieved the peaceful handover of power other than when Mzee Obote received the instruments of independence. So that's what we need to interrogate, and why. Why is it that the story of Africa turned out the way it is today, given that we attained political independence and chose? You can blame now IMF and World Bank, but these are businesses. These are international businesses. Do they follow? Do they come where they are not wanted? No.
I am actually not blaming them.
No. I'm saying, so we need
am-
to interrogate the governance. To me, the problem of Africa has been leadership. A failed leadership, a failure to democratize. By the 60 years ago, we are talking of fighting poverty, disease, and ignorance. 60 years ago, we are
Is
still,
what we are
it is still what we are fighting. For ignorance, poverty, and disease. Except now the leaders have shied away from pronouncing them. But we are still dealing with the same ignorance, poverty, and disease. Why? Look at the quality of education. As we discuss this, Uganda's higher education is a total mess. How do you tell people that what you studied has expired? People acquire skills for a lifetime. How do you wake up and say, after your 4 years or 3 or 5, that what you acquired through higher education has expired? Then what should I do with the skills that I acquired during that time? Even when you put a period that this degree course will expire, then what should happen to the people who acquired it even when it was accredited? How should their credentials be treated? So that this is part of the mess. We have failed to govern ourselves. We have failed to build. At 50 years of AU celebration, the leaders came up with a theme, which I thought was simpler to achieve: silencing the guns. But in 2020, we have about 10 countries facing conflict.
only 10.
And that's why I said that there could be more. So what happened to simple missions, targets like silencing the guns in Africa? By then, the leaders had said that they do not need to pass over the cycle of conflict to the next generation. But just to look at our neighborhood, there is fighting in DRC, fighting in South Sudan, fighting in Sudan. In Uganda, it is a silent civil strife with the citizens either shooting themselves or shooting each other because of the economic crisis that citizens are experiencing. So the question should be, how independent are we? What did we use with the political independence that we attained? And where have we gone wrong?
And why?
Fundamental questions. And Captain,
Yes.
Captain, I have to bring you in. We are trying to take away the gray area and put the events and the momentum towards Africa's independence in black and white. And there are sentiments, as you can hear already. Some think that, it was almost a walk in the park, if I'm to use that kind of phrase. But also, events of the Second World War that made the colonies overly stretched and that they could not continue to exercise their indirect rule. So, I mean, let's just cast a clear picture on the events leading towards Africa's independence.
First of all, right from the Berlin partition of Africa, and then the First World War and the Second World War, the Europeans want to hold onto their colonies because that's where their bread and butter came from.
Yeah.
And a lot of you they underestimate this zeal to continue the hold. Look at the French. Until today, the Central Bank of France has all the former French colonies keep their money there. You seem to forget this, and you seem to think these guys gave you the flag and they gave you a few papers and you waved the flag and you thought you'd got independence. But they went underground and they continued their neo-colonial game. Now, I would like to congratulate all the Africans. After 1957, 1958, a few of them, I think about 8, met in Accra. Because Nkrumah had this dream of having a united Africa. He thought that's the only thing that could help them to defend them from these neo-colonial guys. And in 1963, on the 25th day of May, I think over 30 countries met in Addis Ababa and they started the Organization of African Unity. Although the dream of Nkrumah was refused by a few guys, he wanted a United States of Africa. But other people did not want it, so they ended up with the Organization of African Unity, which some people called the toothless bulldog. But as far as I'm concerned, that was the first time the Africans got together and came out with some sort of organization. And that organization was used to continue to liberate the rest of Africa. And you cannot stop thinking about that because they actually did. The last African countries, the Organization of African Unity, using the frontline states, continued to fight until those countries were liberated. Starting with Mozambique, Northern Rhodesia, Namibia, South Africa, and what was the other one? There was one more, which I forgot.
Angola.
But, yes. So you give them a credit for that. There was an achievement. But then you forget this salient group, which is underground, which continues to have a hold onto the African continent. In fact, I sometimes wonder why you don't look at it. Because, don't blame those guys. No, you can't stop blaming them because they killed our leaders. They killed Lumumba. They killed, even Nkrumah was one of them. They killed Sankara the other day. You cannot leave these guys because their job is completely different. They want to control Africa because of the resources and the riches you have. In fact, one of the biggest problems you people keep on thinking, you've got this belief that these guys mean well. They don't mean well at all. Brentwood group you're talking about, which started the IMF and the World Bank, they did not start them for a joke. These initially were to help them get out of the problems of the war. The Marshall Plan of Japan and Germany came from that. And therefore, these tools were there to control the rest of the world so that they can continue to have the money. They would lend you money, which would put you in a corner and you'll never be able to pay. So I was happy the other day, by the way, let me congratulate my friend Putin for having forgiven us all the debts of Africa. So to me, that was great.
How much had we
So
borrowed
that we
as
forgive him
Uganda?
of
90
ICC.
billion or something? You will not take
Quid
it.
pro quo, something for something. What
Yeah,
does he want to
forgive
do?
him.
But
ICC.
no, he's got his reasons. But to me, that was a way forward. To me, Africa, in fact, let's start with Uganda. Uganda's problem started in 1948 when they had that number Munana. The governor had to even bring the King African Rifles from Kenya to quell this riot. Are you with me? Now, why these guys were just after their land and after the foreigners who were taking up all the trade.
Yeah.
Right? Only two things. Now, you bring the whole King African Rifles from Kenya, plus the King African Rifles in Uganda, it was, I think, the 7th King African Rifles, to quell this group. Nobody wanted to look at this. There was another thing, and this is the most important. Cohen and the British wanted the Federation of East Africa. And when they brought up that federation thing in 1948, in fact, it started around 1948, the Baganda were jittery about it. Having gone through the last few years with the Kabarega and their kings dying, they were not very happy about it. Now, from that time up to 1961, the Baganda never wanted to participate in any political thing. That was very unfortunate. To me, I go against the Baganda for this because the federation, if they had understood it, they would have got the powers they had wanted in the federation system
Yes.
made by these British. But they never realized that the federation caused us problems. One, UNC had been formed in 1950 somewhere. The DP had been formed. What these guys realized that all the parties being formed were being formed by the Baganda. The same Baganda didn't want the federation. What did they do? They had kicked out of Makerere University. He was working with his brother in Nairobi, Tom Mboya. They went out there, brought him back to join the UNC. UNC was divided by the same characters. Are you with me? So you had members who were outside Buganda and those of Buganda. So Musazi remained with the one of Buganda. The one outside Buganda went along and they started UPC. It was a divide and rule game these guys were playing all along. The Baganda made another big mistake. They did not go for the legical. They abstained. The same group in 1961 refused to go for election. DP won, Muganda won, and they started fighting the same Muganda they put there. This is something they had made a mistake about. Nobody wanted to talk about this, but let me tell you, even the parties that started in 1950s, were all started on sectarian basis. They were religious parties, they were propaganda parties, and so on and so forth. So here we are. We are going into independence. What the British did, they really coached their man very well to beat this Muganda man who was already chief minister. They made him go to Bamunanika here. He put on a kanzu and knelt before the king. He got 21 members of parliament automatically. So at the election in 1962 in April, he won in certain areas because of the 21 people, although DP won in a lot of places.
No. That's not true.
Which one?
Maybe I will elaborate.
No,
I'll be given
no,
opportunity.
no.
Can I
We should
chip
do-
in?
yes, yes, we should
No,
do.
it's not true that UPC didn't win.
No, they win in some, they won.
No, not some. Actually, UPC won the 1962 elections. It had the majority. It had 34 seats against 24 of DP and against 21 of KY.
Okay.
The only thing is that since it was a
They didn't have
parliamentary
majority.
system,
They
it
needed
didn't
a
have a
majority.
comfortable majority. That's why they had
They
to form
formed a
an alliance
coalition.
with KY to form a KY UPC government. Not that UPC lost 62 elections. That's what I wanted to correct.
Okay, fine. So they got the 21 guys. So they got the government going, and that's how it started. Not barely a year later, they convinced the opposition to cross the floor. What happened? They all went on the government side,
One party
and
system.
immediately after that, your multi-party went to blazes.
Yeah. Because
We
if
now had one
opposition
party system.
crosses the floor,
All I'm trying to
He
say,
was actually the leader of opposition, Basil Bataring.
he was.
with some majority.
What I'm trying to say here, these guys were not very far. They were behind. They were not very far. So our African leaders, you blame them with a pinch of salt. They had somebody behind pushing the accelerator. So that is Uganda for you. In Kenya, they had something else. They had two parties. One was KANU, the other one was KADU. KADU wanted the Majimbo, which was a federation, and the other one didn't want it. And they had elections, and KANU won because of the liberation war they had there, and the other one went on the opposition. Also didn't take a long time, they also crossed the floor. So at the end of the day, the divide and rule of our friends, they continued up until today. They're still playing games with us. And they're still using that same thing of sanctions, same thing of not giving us enough money to run our countries. They tell you what to do. They actually even tell you that you don't know what you're doing. So as far as I am concerned, the people in 1963, on the 25th day, had the right way to say that was an African day because they all got together. And not only that, they also had a few things, although it was weak, they had not got what they had wanted, which would have been a bigger organization for the whole of Africa. They got this one and they started working with it. It was there for some time until the other day when we got the African Union. And of course, here we must also say something else. Every leader who wanted to make that thing even more powerful was eliminated. And the last one to be eliminated was our friend Gaddafi. So you've got to be very careful when you're talking about these guys. A few of our leaders, of course, fell into the traps of power, the traps of corruption, and so on and so forth. They're there. But most of them did quite a good job in the beginning and worked for some time. Later on, we've had people who have followed up with unfortunate things, people like Nyerere. With all his weaknesses or his strength, he created a nation which he united.
Yeah.
And that's another point we must look at.
Yes.
When these guys went to Berlin, they did not put the borders correctly so that a country could be united. We had people in those countries of diversity. That alone also was a position of divide and rule. They could play with that game. In Tanzania, Nyerere managed to put the 102, is it 102 tribes?
And something like that.
Yes. And he managed to put them together. He cemented them together. He made them become one. He lost a lot of things. The economy went to the dogs, but he united that country. And after uniting it, it has now got a foundation where all the things that we want can now work. We now have democracy there. You're having a constitution which is being operated with a few problems here and there, but at least it's working. They have had different leaders every 10 years. It has worked very well. So we've heard one, at least that's a success story. In some other places, we've not had that one because the beginning was not very good, right? So when we are talking about these countries, I see South Africa is also on a foundation and moving forward. And I think we better thank the old man who said, look, I'm too old for this. Let's have another leader. Another leader came, so they're following the constitution. A few others also are doing a reasonable job. They are coming up. I'm seeing that Kenya is beginning to get there also, but it's gone through thick and thin to get there. They still have a few problems. But I think the African Union is still a good platform for the African countries to get together. Let me end with this one. A white man wrote a very nice statement about Africa and other countries. He said, whilst the Chinese, the Korean, the Indians have studied their former colonial masters and learned how they play the game, Africa has not. We have not understudied these characters. We've not understudied the West, the so-called international community. We have not understood how they work. The Asians have, and their economies are beginning to pick up, and their democracy is also beginning to pick up. We must now stop for a moment and say, wait a minute, where are we missing the boat? What is our problem? And I think now the leaders who are in Africa must sit down and say, wait a minute, what is our problem? And until they get to that stage, when they can say, what is our problem and what are the solutions, we're still in a quagmire. I think I would like to end there.
Well,
Just
Moses,
very quickly.
maybe just,
Yes, please.
yeah, Moses, 1 minute. You know, I want to, as a matter of fact, I was born I was born in the late 80s. But then what informs my thinking about Africa is reading through African literature, post-independence African literature. Because I have actually listened to the sentiments here. And what everyone does is do some bit of cherry picking of good examples to say, let's give credit to the African leaders. They will single out a few outliers like Nyerere, who did an amazing job, Patrice Lumumba, to use them to cloud.
He was in power for only 1 year.
Yes, but even Sankara, you see, it is not about the longevity of power. Like someone said, that the measure of life is not its duration, but it is its contribution.
But Chris,
So cherry picking.
Chris, just a minute.
Yes.
Using your same standard,
Yes.
and you also cherry picking when you take away credit from the genuine
No, you see, but
pre-independence and immediate post-independence
look
leaders
at,
call it romanticization.
but let us
Why
look at the
don't you
entire
mention
Africa.
who was fake? Point out exactly who you think was fake.
Actually, the reason why I have not pointed out is because I don't have the time. I don't have the entire time in the show to point it out.
Mention three.
You see that?
Who you think was
I have
fake?
already talked about Nkrumah.
Who was fake?
I have talked about Nkrumah. In Uganda here, you know, post-independence, we've actually never had a state. You see? In fact, Uganda...
There was a state, but weak.
Yeah, Uganda's actually never had a state. Uganda's never had a state, as we talk. Okay,
I'm sorry, I don't agree with you.
No,
We don't.
There's a state, like he's
But
saying,
weak.
it's got its weaknesses.
We are not stateless.
Anyway, okay, let me concede. Let me concede.
And on the African continent, there's a country called Uganda. In the world, there's a country called Uganda.
With
It
borders.
is a juridical state.
Who is a member
You
of
know,
United
it is-
Nations,
yeah,
members of African Union.
because
It
it
might
is a
not be
juridical-
strong,
Yeah.
but it's there.
You see, it is Prof here who was talking about a state being in the hearts of the people, the state being empirical. You just see it and say, this is an existing state.
You're
It
now
works for the people.
you're now being romantic.
You are the one romanticizing.
No, it is actually you. It is actually you people.
No, that is romance.
Who are looking at the juridical
State, okay.
existence,
Correct, juridical state.
juridical existence of a state,
Yeah, this
and
is
saying
the
that the state exists. But all in the bottoms of our hearts, we really know what we have.
Your
here
heart. There are others
is
who
not
there-
is
there are
not the
others-
kind of state.
No, there
that
are
we
others.
want.
It is in their hearts.
But
It is
anyway,
your heart.
going back
Yeah.
to going back to the point, when you read post-independence literature, Aikwe ama.
Written by who?
Africans.
Yeah.
Aikwe ama. Ngugu wa Thiongo, Mercedes-Benz Funeral is my classic in terms of actually showing how, because we should not judge people by rhetoric. They spoke very well about the need to decolonize Africa, but they did not act very well when we talk about independence. Because at the end of it all, the end result was independence. So if you liberated us, not to give us economic independence, not to give us political independence, then what independence did you liberate us from? And talking about, because if these people really meant well, they should have actually designed, like Nyerere actually, with his Ujamaa policies, he brought up a state of where there's national unity. Couldn't these African leaders come up? Because remember, the African governance DNA is actually an hierarchical society, not hierarchies as presented by modern government. Hierarchies. Heterarchies has been the DNA of Africa. So if, for example, we are already talking about governance failures in Africa based on these models, and if they meant well, why didn't they model a system of government based on the African DNA of a hierarchy?
That's a good question.
And that is now where the whole question of state reform comes. And short of that, it meant they just loved the colonial hierarchies, the goodies that come with them, and merely they wanted to chase them away so that they replace them and take over, and with all that kind of glory, instead of working for the people. Yeah.
Fair enough, fair enough. And Professor, if I'm to just pick it up from where Chris has stopped, is that Chris is trying to say that post-independence was an era of constitutionalism. Many African states post-independence adopted legal frameworks. Uganda had the 1962 independence constitution and things like that. And he's trying to say that we adopted a mode of governance that perhaps we were not prepared for. And that is why, even when these constitutions required us to have elections every maybe in a given period of time, African states were used to their own means of governance. Like if you look at Buganda, they had their own means through which they would administer justice, means through which they would trade. Now here they were shifting post-independence to a new form of governance that now you must use a constitution and things like that. So perhaps the question that Dambisa Moyo posed, we could examine it, that were African states perhaps ready for all this multi-party dispensation and all these sort of governance frameworks that came with the white man post-independence?
We tried constitutional democracy at independence. Almost every country was left with a constitutional democracy design and system, but we have since had a constitutional crisis. The latest constitutional crisis manifestation is in term limits, removing term limits, and which have caused a crisis in most countries in Africa. Of course, now we have even military coups, which had ended by 1890s, but now they have come back in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Sudan. I don't know where next. I think at independence, to use the biblical expression, the spirit was willing, but the body was weak. So the post-colonial state in Africa had big challenges, because the colonial states, colonialists created states, but they did not create nations. By nations, we mean the software. I mean, we have a situation where we have states without nations. You had states with boundaries. You had states with some governments in place, but the population, the different populations in their different ethnic groups, in some countries like in Sudan, even they have racial differences. Here we mainly have ethnic differences. So what had kept these African states together, the colonial states in Africa together, was force of the colonial powers, because the French, the British, the Italians, the Portuguese, they had power, they had coercive machinery, which overwhelmed the Africans by the 1920s, and Africans had actually acquiesced. They didn't accept. I don't think Africans accepted colonialism. They acquiesced. There are situations and conditions where you cannot do anything. You simply say, okay, let me give up and wait. So it was a fallacy to say that they were nation states. They were not there. These were just colonial states that were kept together by colonial hard power, coercive machinery that they had. And in terms of relationships between different communities and different ethnic groups or racial groups and religious groups, were kept together by the colonial hard power. But latently, they were not together. These different communities and religious groups were not together. So the British and the French or whatever, they were like the referees that were keeping us together. The moment the referees went, these empires went away. Now the other differences flared up. Were they inevitable? I would say no. The post-colonial governments and states could have kept these challenges at arm's length. Definitely there were challenges. The post-colonial governments inherited weak states, but they could have done better. I think why they didn't do better is because the leaders were greedy for power. They refused to share power, so that those who also wanted to share the power, you could have mechanisms put in place, designed in such a way that they are kept together. Unfortunately, the colonial masters, like in our case, Uganda, the British left us with the Westminster model, which I think was not a constitutional design that was suitable for Uganda. Because this winner take all, that once you go for elections and you win, then the rest should keep off. You will hold the power yourself. I think some people have refused to accept this one. It was the late Dr. Semogere who proposed it. I think proportional representation would possibly have gone some way to bring us together. But this winner take all, in a situation where you have got these differences. You see, Uganda is a heterogeneous country, like most other African states. We have got different religions, we have got different ethnic groups, different cultures. I heard the people talk about that Buganda had its own governance system. Yeah, but how many governance systems were here? The Bakonzo had theirs, the Baganda had theirs, the Bateso had theirs, the Bachika had theirs, the Banyangore, Bunyoro, Karamoja, whatever. Now, can we now revive all those systems and operate in the 21st century? We had to have one system.
Unitarist.
Not necessarily unitary. It could be federal even. But the post-colonial leaders did not allow us space. Like they are not allowing us space as citizens to sit together and think about designing a certain constitutional arrangement which would be suitable to our conditions. Because they are greedy for power. There is a sense in which I want to agree with him. Even these Nkurumas we are praising, they were authoritarian. They didn't want to share power with the rest. When they came into power, they fell into things. They started calling themselves funny names. Also, Jaffe, he was a major. I don't know, Kaunda was called what? He was also something. Mobutu. Kuku was a bang. I don't know. Kenya was the tar.
Wasn't Mwalimu ordained a saint?
He's not yet ordained.
Not yet.
But even Mwalimu had some authoritarianism, but sometimes authoritarianism is not necessarily negative in these post-colonial states which are not yet nation states. The challenge, you see, the challenge of African governments is justice. Justice, we lack social justice, and we lack economic justice. These African leaders, some wanted to amass wealth. How on earth do you find post-colonial leaders, past especially, let's talk about the past, not the present, so that we are not going to be subjective or whatever. Africa is a poor continent, low-income countries, but their leaders are the richest in the world. They are richer than those of the first world. The daughter of Dos Santos is the richest woman in the whole of Africa. Mobutu was, I think, among the richest in Africa. Bashir was, they found what? Bank notes, dollars stacked in
and even whiskey. Yet he's a Muslim.
You know, these African leaders, like they fell into things. I think during Idi Amin there was an expression called mafuta minji. They just fell in mafuta and forgot to construct states. While we are crediting Nyerere, he was not as greedy as these African leaders that we have had. And there are very many examples. Nyerere would go to a bank to borrow money to pay fees for his children. Nyerere never built himself a house in Butiama until he retired, and CCM built him a house in Butiama. Nyerere was living in the means, in his means, like the other the fellow citizens. Now, Africans' primitive accumulation, to use the Marxist language, primitive accumulation of capital of our leaders. By leaders, I don't mean only presidents. And their other hangers home, those who are hanging around them, they will support anything provided it can allow them to primitively accumulate. Sorry to give a live example of Cameroon now. There is a man there, I think he's 90 years. Sorry to say, I think he's senile.
He lives in Switzerland in an hotel.
The other day he was in USA at an African summit, and they brought him to speak. Did you see that video? He was saying, should I speak? By the way, who is around? But my problem is not with him. My problem is with people who are surrounding this gentleman. Habib Bourguiba of Tunisia actually also remained in power until the age of 83. And he became senile. He would appoint you as a minister of finance. The following day, you come to see him to over something. He would say, "Who are you? What have you come to do here?" And you are his minister of finance, you know. Until his vice decided to bring a car and say, "I think, Mzee, please, can you please go home?" By the way, let me make a statement here, which many Ugandans have got wrong, including even members of CA. I don't know what Babu can even say here, can allege here. The question of term limits in Uganda was proposed, came from me. Not because they wanted to keep Obote off. It came from me. I discussed it with...
limit?
Yeah,
Age
limit, sorry, age limit. Age limit, not term limit. I discussed it with Professor Simwe, because we were researchers there. We called Mayombo outside. I gave him the example of Tunisia, when your president became 83, completely senile. He appoints you, the following day he has forgotten you. I said, how can such a person be allowed to run a state in the 21st century? I said that one can't be happening. I gave them an example of my whole own home area. I come from a defunct state called Mpororo Kingdom. Mpororo Kingdom was bigger. Many people don't know it. There was a kingdom in southwestern Uganda which was larger than the rest of the kingdoms like Nkore and Toro and whatever. It disintegrated completely on account of the leader Kahayat Ndajezi remaining in power. His sons asked him to surrender. He became senile. He refused to go. The day he went, when he was saying,
Are you saying Uganda will disintegrate like Mpororo?
the country disintegrated. Mpororo is no longer. I am a former Mpororo now because the state disintegrated on account of.
Did your identity expire?
It expired.
As you conclude, Professor.
My identity expired
The former
on account
Mpororo
of
kingdom.
on account of Kayari Kindajezi refusing to hand over power to his sons. He comes saying, and they said disintegrated.
As you conclude.
Beirete here can give us more about the constitutional crisis today of term limits and ending term limits and the age limits. Now, when some of these countries disintegrate on account of that, if Cameroon today disintegrated, there is a country called the Equatorial Guinea. Somebody, I think he's the oldest reigning president in terms of being in office. He came into office in 79. His son, by the way, is a vice president. Equatorial Guinea has oil. When you look at its oil earnings and look at the poverty of Equatorial Guinea, you just wonder. But let me tell you, there are very many people in the government who are supporting Mwema of Equatorial Guinea like he is an angel. Why? Because they are also selfish. Not because they love him, it's because they love themselves more. So when we talk about the leadership, like Sarah here pointed out, I think we should also look at citizens. We citizens have had a problem also because even in Europe, it is not so much of their leaders who are not corrupt. It is because citizens will not tolerate corrupt leaders. So post-independence, Africa has also had a crisis of citizens' participation in their governance. We have remained subjects as we were in pre-colonial and colonial period. We have not become citizens. A citizen is somebody who understands the situation and environment in which he or she is living in and endeavors to better it, to do something about that condition. There are very many Africans here, Ugandans, elites, who are somewhere in Kororo, in Muyenga, in this minister's village here in Ntinda. They understand the situation, but they just keep quiet. They say, in our language, in Runyangore, they say, Chitandiga. I don't want it to come from me. Let me just keep quiet. The situation is not good. I am not doing anything. And I want to tell you, those people are subjects. They are not citizens.
Wow, thank you very much. Former
Kingdom disappeared.
It's not former, they were horrors are still there.
No, they expired.
But yeah.
They expired.
There are many,
Thank
even
you.
in Parliament,
Thank
we
you.
have
We are
a
due
few.
for a short commercial break.
No.
And I
Yes.
believe we have attempted to explore particularly the aspect of the decolonization of Africa. Our phase 2 shall focus more on the African continental free trade area and the nitty-gritties therein, and how best can African states fast-track its implementation. See you after this.
Digital rights are those human rights and legal rights that allow individuals to access, use, create and publish digital media or to access and use computers, other electronic devices and telecommunication networks. Digital rights include a right to freedom of expression, information and communication through technology, a right to privacy and data protection, a right to credit for personal works, a right to universal and equal digital access, a right to identity, a right to anonymity, a right to be forgotten, and a right for protection of minors, among others. The state's digital rights are frequently violated through various unfair actions, for example, blockage of websites and social networks, theft of credentials, unauthorized use of people's data for personal gain, privacy intrusion, online censorship, arrests and intimidation of online users, internet blockages, and the proliferation of laws and regulations that undermine the potential of technology to drive social, economic, and political development worldwide. It is hence every citizen's responsibility to respect rights of other digital users and to speak out or report to the responsible parties when one's rights are violated.
We'll be back from that short commercial break. Doctor, let me just begin with you straight away. I believe you have attempted to unpack the political independence and our political struggles. Let's now shift gears to what the African Union declared a theme for this year's celebration, which is fast-tracking the acceleration of the African Continental Free Trade Area. I don't know. Is it already 17 years old, that particular agreement? the ACFTA?
No, it can't be.
No. It's,
Okay,
But the process began a long time. But
Yeah.
this one was signed in Rwanda,
yeah,
very
about
recent.
5 or so
Even
years
less
ago.
than
Yeah,
5.
so Doctor, what exactly, in your words, is impeding the progress of this particular very good document or agreement?
Maybe just in one sentence to first, put a closure on the debate we had in the first session. I think nobody can take away the efforts of the African people in the fight for independence. It was a real struggle for independence.
Wow,
And
wow.
almost in all countries, it was a real struggle. But what faced our post-independence government was lack of clarity for purpose during those initial years of in government. You have taken power. What is the clarity of purpose? How do you want to build the formation of the state? How do you want to go about it? And we've discussed how Tanzania and other countries went about theirs, and other countries which failed now to go beyond being a client state for the colonialists and then building a real state with the nationalism principles. It remained, rhetoric, nationalism, African unity, all that remained in the rhetoric. And of course, the enemy did not go far. They just went behind the door. So whenever confusion would set in, then people, where do you run if you fail to agree with your brother? You are running to a person who failed to marry your mother. What do you expect? So that's part of the confusion that befell Africa. Africa was not the only place that was colonized. America was colonized by the same people.
Even
there are countries
Britain
that
was colonized
so,
by the Romans.
So we failed to pick up right from independence. And that's why
why
we
did we fail?
Yes,
That's the right
that's
question.
what we need to demystify. Why did we fail? Can we pick up now? Because there's talk under the African Rising. There's talk of the second liberation of Africa. It has been on, I think, since even the shift from OAU to AU. Second African liberation, but it has failed. And part of it is the greed and selfishness of the leaders. The argument of sovereignty. If I'm a head of state, how do I then adopt another title? The same is happening with the integration process, even in East Africa. Where are we? We are not disintegrating, but we are not progressing either. It is stagnation. The selfishness, the lack of foresight on the part of individuals, and of course the larger absence of the citizens who are more as subjects. We fear to confront issues. We don't have space sometimes. Even when you have space, everybody just wants to sound good and go and cut their deals. They don't want to address issues for the common good and the bigger picture in their countries. So that's largely the dilemma that we are in. So when it comes to the Africa free, trade area agreement, so far 42 countries have ratified out of 55, and some have not deposited their instruments. And the quest for that is to create a free trade area for Africa. But how will people trade when there is no free movement of persons? As we talk today, out of the 55 countries, there are only 3 countries where Africans do not require a visa to go at any given moment. Seychelles, Benin, and the Gambia. The rest, it is selective. I used to think that people do not require visas in Ghana until on arrival with the South Sudanese colleague. He was pulled off the side to go and process a visa. So I used to think that Ghana was also free, but it's just selectively free. South Africa is the most hard to reach and hard to access country in Africa, but it's beginning to open up for Kenya. So there is no uniformity or determination of leaders to say, because what does decolonization mean? Decolonization means, first of all, do away with visas. If you are determined to create a free trade area, you have created way for goods. Will goods move on their own? Do we have robots to move these goods?
We remove these colonial borders, but they are colonial borders in our minds.
Yes. So the mindset, you have, there are 26 countries where most Africans can easily go. The rest are problematic. And why? Why? So even if that agreement comes into force, will the goods move on their own? The process of people moving in Africa, structurally with visas, problematic. Connectivity of the continent. Sometimes you are going to Arusha, you first go to Addis Ababa, you take a whole day traveling to Arusha in the neighborhood. So that the African leadership has great relaxed focus on issues that would be simpler to say, let's create free movement, remove visas, create connectivity in terms of faster railway, put connectivity in. I don't know why Uganda Airlines goes once a week, for example, to Arusha. I was in Arusha last month.
Maybe not enough passengers.
You spend a whole day, 6 hours of waiting in Nairobi, in a place that you would ideally take 1 hour to fly. You are going to Ghana. It's a whole day in a plane. 12 hours in transit, in where at this at times you can find you are sleeping. Just connect to your neighbor in Africa. So we have not focused our mind on what it takes to decolonize Africa. And that is a failure of leadership. Then beyond that, of course, it is a governance dilemma.
Crisis, actually.
It's a crisis. 80% of African countries, if not all, are misgoverned with selfish leaders, corruption, with increasing poverty, increasing income inequalities, and now we are in a climate change crisis. And without governance, you cannot address climate change.
Fair enough. Chris, I want to get to you.
Yeah.
The aspect of having non-tariffs, all right? If, non-tariffs where goods can move freely. And someone makes the argument that, some countries still continue to levy prices or levy or attach a cost to customs duty and etc. But South Sudan was honest at some point and said that they don't think they are at the same economic strength with other member states. And that is why they still need this revenue. In that, even when other member states in the EAC removed the fee on visas, South Sudan continued to charge for visas because they said we still need this revenue. So as we evaluate the possibility of having a free trade area, should we put into perspective the difference in terms of economic strength of the different countries, or we should just go, wholesomely and say whether you're South Sudan or you're South Africa, let's all open up our borders and we trade?
I think it should boil back to the classical political economy of Ricardo on comparative advantage. I think that would solve that question. But I think my submission is not going to be any different from that of Sarah. Recently, I saw you in Morocco.
Yes, sir.
If I am not mistaken, you may have flown first to Turkey and then returned back to Casablanca.
Yeah.
You see that? When I was still the national youth leader of the Democratic Party, I traveled with Norbert Mao and General Muntu to the Gambia. And it took us 18 hours. You have to go, by the time you even arrive in Banjul airport, you don't even know what airline, you don't even now understand the name of the airline.
Oh,
and yet you started with Ethiopian Airways, you went to Bole, then to Kotoka, and then by the time you reach Lome to now proceed, you now don't know, the airline, is it called Pan Air, something like that, that you completely don't understand. And I think that is actually what is making Africa very poor, you see. You see this Africa, this free trade, this free movement, people should also not look at it only in terms of goods. It should also be in terms of social relations, interactivity. For example, if I have a girlfriend in Joburg, do you know how much I'm going to pay? Over 6,000 rand to just reach Joburg and come back. And yet we are talking about integrating African people, which also includes social integration meanwhile. Because because let me tell you, I have always argued that economics and politics is actually powered by social interests. because both the economics and the politics work for the social. Because it is because I want to have a good social life, that is when I work hard to sell goods in the market and then reach that point. So instead of I see a lot of meetings happening in Addis Ababa about the Africa Free Continental Trade Area. And I keep asking myself that, do these guys actually know that there is only one thing they need to do to Africa, and then they will solve all Africa's questions.
To unlock its potential.
Unlock it. Many people travel. If you went to Istanbul right now and you want to connect to Izmir, do you know you're going to pay $50? And that distance could actually even be the same distance as maybe Morocco to Uganda. And you'll pay only $50. I am sure these are experiences you've had. Connecting in between countries in Europe. It's for a very paltry amount of money. And yet those are rich people. But in Africa, where people are poor, when I went to do consultancy for the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Juba last year, the airfare was actually $400. You imagine 1 hour. Before you even finish your meal, they said, guys, you've already arrived. Then you now say, all this money for what? A distance that should have actually been only $50 or even less, $30. You see? So, in fact, that actually tells you that in Africa, as Africans, we are actually the biggest enemies to ourselves. And that is why initially I was actually saying that we don't need to over-romanticize about Africa's liberation. Africa's liberation will come from common sense. Africans just need common sense. Even when you talk about the West, all the China and all these other countries saying they are going to come to colonize Africa. As Africans, we have already colonized ourselves enough.
But now we are under
You see?
China.
No, we are. You see, the issue there is no one. You see, all these are just.
We surrendered.
All
Maybe
this
you
is
say
just
that
shadow
we
boxing.
surrendered.
You know.
No, the last time I was here with General Mugishamuntu, he gave us a good analogy of the issue of immunity.
Immunity for the body.
He says, okay, it is a given that these other forces, whether Chinese, Russian,
These
European,
are
Western,
opportunistic
they are
infections.
opportunistic, they will come, they are opportunistic infections. Can Africans have a robust immunity against these opportunistic infections? As long as you don't put your house in order, strengthen your state, and therefore immunize yourself against all these other opportunistic people coming, they will come. So please, Africans should put their house in order.
Yes.
AU should put their house in order to resist these opportunistic infections.
Yes, and to proceed from there, by the way, sometimes it is good Sarah brought it up on the question of colonization. Even Britain was colonized. So how long are we Africans? How long are we Africans going to give the excuse of colonization?
Not even in this century, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, India, they were colonies.
Everybody was
Where have they left us?
And by the way, looking at Egypt, where 2 days ago I was actually reading about Egypt in 1650 BC, before Jesus Christ was born, to 1550. Egypt was actually colonized and their civilization destroyed by the Hyksos. And that was the 5th dynasty. But we know very well that Egypt kept on rebounding, even when the Greek came and disorganized them, the Romans came and disorganized them.
What about the Arabs?
Yes, the Arabs also came, but they kept on rebounding. So if ancient Africans can rebound from, then what is stopping us to rebound from colonialism? I think we should stop. We should stop these excuses. But now, Kidega, when we talk about free movement of goods, which goods? What is Africa producing?
Hash avocado.
What is Africa producing if we are to say Africa free continental area? Which goods are we producing? So meaning we also need to work on value addition You see? Now, you were even saying, for example, you were even asking and saying Sudan was giving an excuse. Sudan has a lot of excuses. I remember when I was harassed in their airport, and the excuses they gave, they said, man, of course they just needed $50 corruption from me, and they said, pay here $50. And I told them, for what? Is there a receipt for it? Then they said, man, they took me into a security room there. And they said, look at this Junubin. Junubin means a South Sudanese. Even Junubin is paid. Then who are you with a Ugandan passport?
I want to bring Captain.
So, yeah, before you bring in Captain, the whole issue is that Africa, even if Africa opens up, without Africa dealing with the question of production, their productivity, and states being intentional, knowing what is their comparative advantage. Let me tell you, this continent has a lot of huge potential. China was supposed to be fed by Madagascar. If Madagascar did not go into war because of Ratsirak and maybe Ravalamanana, they would conglomerate. Was already requesting over almost a quarter of Madagascar to farm food to feed Chinese. Because China at present has no arable land that is meant, it has no arable land that can feed Chinese. Egypt has 75,000 acres of land in Uganda for wheat production. So these are things instead of, so you can actually see a classic case of a state that does not actually have any proper economic planning. Instead of Egypt, for example, saying we are going to have we are going to go to Uganda and farm 75,000 acres of land. Why doesn't Uganda enter into a food agreement and utilize the free continental trade area to say Uganda exports to Egypt? Definitely, there is even something we need from Egypt, and it moves into Uganda.
Yeah.
So without addressing, first of all, what we produce, being intentional on what we want, and opening up the continent, then I think we are going to continue having AU ACTA meetings, be just for us to take tea, pictures, and maybe take very
Heavy per diem.
yeah, everybody.
Congratulate each other for surviving a military coup.
Captain. Actually, Professor has preempted my thought. Is that amidst mooting the idea of a free trade area is conflict. That even if they opened up and said, okay, now let's trade together, someone still cannot take their goods to Sudan at the moment.
Congo here.
To Congo, because of the conflict there. So, I don't know, are there underlying issues that even if we actualized this free trade area, it is just impractical because of the conflict, terrorism, transnational terrorism here and there? I don't know, how do you deal with the issue of security as a foundation for good trade?
Thank you very much. Apart from the conflict, which is also got a different source for having those conflicts, one has to look at what Nyerere said in that meeting which you people are talking about, when Nkrumah was talking about United States of Africa, and the Nyerere group was saying, no, let's start with the regional groups so that we can build them and eventually build the African United States. I think it's a very good idea to start, because if the Chinese have the saying that even for 1,000 miles, you must make the first step. I have no problem with them making the first step. But the question is, it was the Nyerere's idea of having regional groups starting this trade and eventually move on to the African level viable. I think that would have been the best thing. But even the regional trade, we are not doing it very well. And we are having problems with it. East African community has come up with all sorts of protocol, free movement, the East African common market.
Common market.
They have come out with the customs and
And nobody respects what they agree.
And the things we have done up to now have a few problems. But this goes back to the very thing that I was talking about earlier on. Although you people keep on telling me that we should not talk about our former colonial masters, when the colonial masters were here for 70 years, they didn't teach us their system. They didn't teach us their model. In 1962, they said, goodbye, here is your flag. And this is the model from us.
But they wanted to create an East African Federation and you refused it.
That's right. I know. I'm coming to that. No, I'm coming to that. And when they wanted to create this, we refused, as I told you earlier on. But here comes now. They said, oh, you're a very nice fellow. Here's your flag. We are leaving. This is the model. You know, even your parliament will be built according to, you know, the one in Britain. You know, go on. And here you go. You jump in the deep end. And the deep end, you start by crossing the floor. And so, anyway, all these things come up. They pile up. And they not only pile up here. Even in Kenya, they had the same problem. Even in Tanzania, they had a few problems of that nature.
They still have.
Yeah. And here, we are now talking about a free trade area of Africa, which is not bad, because at one time we were talking about sugar and the tariffs you put on. There's a big, small, quiet rule that you don't sell sugar to us because we also produce sugar. At one time we didn't have sugar here and we had to go, I think, to Malawi or someplace where they produce very good sugar. And because they were not in the African trade area, we had to put on very high charges. And therefore, the sugar was too expensive for us to import. But these are examples that I'm giving you, and there are many more. Are there things we can trade with each other? Yes, they are there. But we have not finished with our regional trade area. How are we going to make it the whole African area? Apart from saying, yes, we have started it, it's on the book, and so on and so forth. But the one here, between Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, Southern Sudan, and Congo.
There is also COMESA.
Yeah, there's COMESA.
Which we are not doing very well.
I'm coming to that one. You have COMESA. The South Africans have got theirs also. West Africans have got the West African one. I'm told ECOWAS is not working at all. Then you have the Maghreb.
But it is working at the political level.
Yeah, political level it is. The Maghreb is not, I'm talking about market now. We were talking about market.
Yes, the market.
The Maghreb is having the same problem. They don't like each other to begin with. You find the Tunisians are fighting with this one. By the way, when she was talking about the 55 states, don't say it when you're in Morocco. They'll put you in jail. Because for them, they know it's 54.
No, sir.
You know, at one point they applied to be part of European Union.
I know. I'm just trying to give you the picture of the way we think. Therefore, it's a very good idea theoretically to have an African free trade area. Sure. It's a very good idea.
In principle.
In principle, it's a very good. The question is, can we implement it? Because even ours here, where you have the East African industries, which by the way is owned by the British. It's not the Kenyan government. The East African industries were put there by the British. They're the ones which supply the whole of East Africa. And then it's one of the things that you people have never realized. Why did ShopRite come here? Why did games come here? People have never thought about it. What the South Africans wanted, because during apartheid, they built a lot of industries that produced. They wanted to use those ShopRites to sell their products in all the African countries. And initially, when they came here, you went to those shops.
Everything was imported.
Everything was from South Africa.
Even eggs.
Even eggs. So I wanted to show you the reason why ShopRite and games came here. So when the customs here says, no, wait a minute. You're not in the East African community system, and therefore your taxes are a bit higher. So the Colgate from South Africa would be more expensive than the Colgate from Kenya. This started getting into the problems with ShopRite, and you can see ShopRite is closed, Games is closed. So we need to sit down and rethink. I have no problem with the principle of the African trade area. I have no problem at all, I can assure you, but unfortunately, I think it will take some years until each country can now produce something that we can buy. A few things which are being assembled in Africa, which probably our colonial masters now want to use these trade areas to sell. And I'll give you an example. Vehicles. The biggest number of vehicles are assembled in South Africa. And now some in Kenya, some in North Africa. I'm told, I think Rwanda is assembling a few.
Yes.
I thought we had started on buses.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to that.
I'm looking forward to that.
But that is not our comparative advantage.
No, I'm giving you, we're talking about trading, really. What are you going to buy from Kenya? Kenya, I've told you, we've got the East African industry, which was supposed to be for the federation he was talking about. Had we had the federation, that would have been for the whole of East Africa. But now it belongs to Kenya. And therefore, all the money goes to Kenya. In fact, the biggest amount that comes from Uganda is the East African industries. Luckily, in I don't know what really happened. We started selling a few things to Kenya, like milk and whatnot, and we nearly got to par what we import and what we export to Kenya. So these are the kind of things we would like to see. But I think the free African trade area will take some time. It's a good idea, but it's in the future. I can't see it becoming realistic right now. If it does, some countries will take advantage of the others.
Yeah, those who are well prepared.
Those who are prepared, like South Africa. When we got this thing in America, what is it called again? This American thing they gave us, where we can export things.
AGOA.
AGOA.
Oh.
South Africa was the one which benefited most.
Yeah.
They were exporting wine, they were exporting finished products, which they have made. You remember I told you about the ones they were making? And they were doing very well. In fact, their wine became the biggest in America. And I think they had a few things like clothes. They were tailoring in South Africa. They started going to American market. So when we got to AGOA, what did we take there apart from a few vests, which now eventually failed?
Apparent.
You know, it is a problem. We need to sit down and, like both of you have put it correctly, are we really ready for that? It is good it is there. It is good to be on the books. We can now give it a time limit. And you get timelines when you can do this, when you can do that. But the East African one has not yet taken off as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
They're talking about a monetary fund, talking about federation, but now they've got away from federation. They are now talking about confederation.
The location of the bank.
Yes, the bank and so on.
But
By the way, the other day I was given the proportions of who owns the African Development Bank. I got frightened. It's owned by foreigners.
Yeah.
Western countries.
There is nothing African about
yeah,
African
but
development.
because
Bank.
we had no clarity of purpose.
Just
After
like
independence.
I'm just saying. I think that
you
begins.
should have said there's nothing African about Africa.
No, there is. We are Africans.
Because you see, even
We are here, and we here.
you see, even in terms of culture.
No. When the king of Swaziland is choosing that's African.
But there is also Ethiopia that fought colonialists and were never colonized. So
Yeah, I
there
know.
is something
But there are
African.
certain attitudes which are African also.
Yes.
Oh,
Never
yes.
mind that some are negative.
And most
But
of
they
them
are
are
African.
negative. Most of them are negative. Not even say that. By the way, at the end of the day, I want to put it this way. We need leaders now. And I keep repeating this to you.
We need institutions.
Yeah, institutions. There are leaders who can create institutions.
Who can create
Institutions will
institutions.
not come
The
automatically.
current ones can.
We should leave them work. We have failed
You
them.
see, we actually need states before institutions.
Okay,
Because
state institutions.
if you anchor institutions on a failed state, the institutions will not work.
That is one word which everybody uses but never does it. We need to unite our countries into a state.
Yes. It's a
And
state
to do-
weakness.
But then you
State
need
failure.
leadership. You need leadership to do that. We don't have leadership to do that. And that's where our problem is. We need to unite each
Leadership.
country. And like Nyerere did, he found a cement at that time to cement it together. What is the cement now we can use to unite our countries? We need to put them together. And once you do that, but before you do, you need a leader who is honest enough to do that.
Yes.
And this is where our problem
We
is.
need real leaders,
Real
other than
leaders.
the
Professor,
selfish lot that we have in
the question
power.
that is being put out in all the sentiments is that is there political will by the political leaders to in fact enforce this very good agreement? Because just like you mentioned here, the treaty that we have here at the EAC level, I saw 2 days ago Kenya has again banned our milk again. I'm not sure. So I don't know, is there political will to actually get these things moving?
I wish I knew where to buy political will. You are raising a very important question. Lack of political will. Where can we buy the political will to implement these
You know
things?
what Rumumba said?
Yes.
All of you here, you've got very good points. But the people in position don't have those points.
So the political will, it's a very important question. The political question is very pertinent. Let me even digress a bit and give an analogy. Last week we were in a seminar or a conference or whatever where they were both launching the fourth development plan, national development plan, but also assessing the mid-term assessment of the third-year development plan. And there are people who have reviewed it, the third-year development plan, which is now more than 2 years, that it has only been implemented by 17%. Where is the implementation deficit? Where can we get it?
So why are they moving to the fourth?
Actually, people were suggesting that why have the fourth now? Let's first implement the third development plan, where we are only 17%. But the NRM says for them, which is also the same period, mid-term review.
Theirs was 21.
Is slightly above. But anyway, the question I'm saying that the political will for the whole of Africa is the missing link. We need to have this missing link. But where do we buy the political will? Me, I have a suggestion, but I don't know how it can be implemented. The political will should come from the citizens. If the citizens held their states, their leaders accountable, you have said there is now a free market, continental free market area. And then you have set a goal. At the end of the term of office of a leader or a government, if you ask them how much have they achieved, and if you have not achieved it, we are not going to return you into office. But that's not what we ask. When they come to elections, we ask other things. We ask for money to drink. We ask for this and that. We are not looking at implementation failure of policies and declarations. If we had those declarations, foreign declarations together, and said, any government, any party that wants to come into power should give us their implementation plan, their implementation roadmap, those who are not in power. Those who are in power, you say, now you put up this roadmap, how far have you gone? You may not have achieved everything because there are certain things which come in between, but we don't do that one. We have AU, which is in Addis Ababa, is hanging there. It is not held accountable by anybody. It is even headquartered in a country that is in disarray. That is, there is no Ethiopia to talk about, but that is where the headquarters are. By the way, I'm told the AU budget is sponsored almost 2/3 by foreign capital. And then you say you can have immunity against foreign recolonization. 60 years ago in 1963, our budget was funded maybe also by foreigners. Today, it is funded by foreigners. Why don't we start? Can these 54 countries fail, really, to fund their headquarters, their secretariat?
But they cannot fund their national budgets.
Even the building where they are was built by the Chinese. Yeah. And you talk about immunization against colonialism, and you say you are liberated when you are staying in the house of somebody. Somebody has built it for you. He gives you money to buy food. He gives you money to pay the civil servants. And you say, where can we have the political will? A very pertinent question, but the political will can come from the pressure from African citizens. How we can organize African citizens is a very big challenge, because these people in power are not giving us space for engagement. But how can we squeeze and get that space for engagement so that the government in power will fear? You see, the fear of the government being overthrown or being removed or being voted out, it can be an incentive for it to act. So how can we, now how many Ugandans know that the third year development plan has been implemented by only 17% when it is almost going to the third year and is almost ending?
And they are making a new one.
And they are making a new one. And we are here, we are very, these wonderful Africans.
Professor, the only way to buy that, we must identify a leader who can empower the citizens. You must get a group of leaders who can empower the citizens the way you want them to.
The citizens
who can demand accountability.
I think, by the way, we don't need a leader to empower us. We need a leader to give us a space, to allow us space.
That's empowering.
That's empowering, okay.
Yes.
So that we buy the currency to buy the political will is a pressure from
You
citizens.
see, when I say
You get it?
You see, like Nyerere, he empowered his people. If you go to Tanzania, I can tell you, you do not play with them. They are very quiet, they look docile, but when it comes to their country, they are not a joke.
In terms of nationalism, in
Yes.
terms of that immunity against foreign intrusion.
Yes.
But at home, in terms of governance crisis,
Is
they
it-
also have a crisis.
Oh yeah, they have
They have a similar crisis.
Yeah, it can't
but
be
to answer
100%.
your question, the currency to buy the political will come from the citizens
citizen.
of Africa. Let Africans stop being subjects. Let them be a citizens. I repeat again that a citizen is somebody who understands the environment, the situation he or she lives in, and acts on that situation to make it better.
Professor-
If the citizens of Uganda remain subjects, we shall continue lamenting until further notice.
Professor, you are a historian. You know that at every area where citizens have been empowered, there is somebody or some people who are behind. No matter what you do. There's like people like you, you are talking now.
The
You are one of those.
intelligentsia, maybe.
That's right. You need a group, for example.
But the intelligentsia we're also missing in the political space.
But we need.
we are quiet.
No, no. What I'm saying, you yourself, you know very well that the French Revolution, there was a group behind.
Yes, the Guizots.
Yes.
Yeah,
Mananias.
citizens
Yeah, they were
must
there.
be
The
organized.
philosophers.
Yes.
The philosophers.
Yes.
Diderot.
Yeah.
So let's buy
We
the
need these
political
people.
will, and it will be from the pressure
We-
of citizens
No.
to hold our states accountable. Otherwise, our states have remained weak.
Yes, Doctor. And thank you, Professor. You make very fundamental points. Doctor, the capacity of the African Union to, in fact, implement and enforce the terms of reference or terms and conditions of this very good document. Do they have the capacity, the African Union?
I want to.
ensure that states that ratify indeed go ahead to, meet the end of the bargain.
Do we know even whether they ratify or not?
I want to
We are
assert
here
here.
taking our
I want to
our
assert
commando.
here that the African Union is a talking shop. I don't expect much
Do they even
from
talk?
that. In photo moment, talking shop, it's a ritual. I don't see any effectiveness of African Union as a citizen of Africa today. And you can go to any department. I know that we have the African Union Commission on Human and People's Rights, Peace and Security Docket, governance, democracy. The best they can do is issue a statement.
That's a copy from United Nations. We just
Yes,
copy.
they cannot do anything. And it is a space also for leaders to cheer each other up. We thank you for frustrating your people. Nobody has the caliber to call the others out. No, they are deeds the way they frustrate the African people in their countries. It should be a platform for calling each other to account, peer-to-peer accountability. It has no capacity. So whether you sign a document, whether it is ratified, it is irrelevant. The African people are on their own. And building on what Professor Davis has said, a community of sheep can only be led by hyenas. And that's what largely Africa is about. So unless we wake up as African people, get a few change makers that we need, to tie the loose ends and demand respect from the leadership, demand accountable leadership, demand that leaders do the right things as per the will and values and aspirations of the people. Africa will remain a sleeping lion, a sleeping giant of the world.
Chris,
Yes.
I have read your article where you did make arguments, and you said that Uganda needs a third republic. And just putting it into the African context, we had our independence African leaders. Then we had those who came in the 1980s. Is it high time that
Why are you jumping the militaries? They were also governments, by the way. The Mafutaminji people.
Yes, true. But Chris, the point is just trying to put together what Doctor is saying is that is it about time Africa began to reorganize itself into creating a third republic sort of continent?
Yeah, I think Africa, the only unfortunate bit is that the so-called Africa rising that we are touting around should have actually been the equivalent of Africa's third republic or Africa's
The fifth column.
resurgence. Yeah, you see the resurgence of
Renaissance.
Africa. Renaissance, yes. But
But you don't proclaim it, you act
yes,
it.
but the challenge is that
Renaissance.
the challenge is that Africa is not owning that agenda. That narrative is even not
Because
even
it
homegrown.
does not favor the selfish road.
It is
that
actually
control the
discussed at
dynamics.
Oxford. You hear there is an Africa rising narrative at Oxford, at Harvard, in the global educational centers. That is where that narrative comes. And why are they saying it is rising? They are saying it is rising because of the population boom, and they are looking at market. You see that?
Oh.
Yes, and they are looking
Not-
at market.
not the other way around.
We're 1.4
yes,
billion.
They are not looking at the
Not
qualitative.
strong states.
Yes, they are not looking at strong states. They are not looking. They are not considering some of these qualitative aspects that we are discussing here.
But quantitative.
Yes, but just the quantitative aspect of Africa, because after all, they don't care. All they need is a big population, as long as market for diapers come in, and then all these market for all these other products. And also, Africa is even not intentional about its governance, because when I say that Uganda needs to chart the way forward for a third republic, my argument was that Obote tried to create some semblance of a republic, which we give him the credit and say he tried to give Uganda a first republic. You see? But just like post-colonial politics that Prof was talking about earlier on, that process of first republic was actually stillborn because of military coups. And then we see again a semblance of a second republic. Museveni, we also need to give credit where it is due. Museveni, with all his machinations, has tried to create a semblance of a republic, a second republic for Uganda, which is even going to disappear with him. We've seen telling tales that what we see as a semblance of a second republic will disappear from him. And then the third republic I am talking about is that we now need a citizen-led third republic. Why? And it covers all these sentiments we are talking about.
Yeah.
That you see, all these two experiences, what these two experiences should tell us is that you cannot anchor states on individual. You must anchor states on citizens. And if we are to create a citizen-led
Which is what
republic,
Professor was saying.
That's what I was saying.
Yes, which is what Prof is saying. And you know, the missing link of democracy in Africa is actually the citizen. Why? Because democracy is preceded by democratic citizens, meaning the citizens must first have the software, the mind, to actually anchor a democracy. So in the absence of a citizen who understands democracy, we have seen how electoral democracy, how very fun it is. Someone comes with alcohol, and then the entire group, just look at our parliament. Our parliament is actually it tells you about our electoral democracy. The absence of quality, meaning that the sieve we use, the citizens use to grant us leaders, is represented in that parliament. So in the absence of citizens taking their role seriously, Africa is a basket case of failure. So, and then this also brings us to, when we are also talking about democracy, and the Saras here in the democratic space, and they need to listen to this. Me, I actually think that the reverse is true about democracy. What the failures of liberal democracy should tell us, is that democracy, the reverse about democracy that we are talking about, is actually true. Because one, we really move around using very big language such as constitutional democracy. But constitutional democracy, to me, by the way, is not even the end of democracy. It is just a process towards real democracy.
No, actually, it is
Me,
an
I
instrument.
think- yes,
a
it's an
means.
instrument.
It's an instrument.
Yes, because
It should be a means to
democracy, for me, I
It's an
actually
instrument
think,
of a functioning state.
Yes.
yes, but also when we talk about democracy and we talk about, because you see, democracy scholars have actually also misled Africa because of their liberal paradigms
Why
of
should
democracy.
they mislead
You see, because
Why
they have-
don't Africans write
they
their
have
own
said,
things?
they have said that, you see, this is their argument. Their argument is that we should all aspire towards constitutional democracy. But you see, constitutional democracy is not the end of democracy. Democracy, I've since discovered, must be consocial.
Meaning
Because dialogue is very important for democracy. Because you see, like these arrangements,
But
you
I
see.
thought dialogue is an element of democracy, of a democratic process.
No, but
why
you
are
see,
you putting it as an outcome?
But you see, at the end of it all, I would want you to be interested in the concept of consocial democracy and consocial states. Because it looks like you, and you've even talked about it in your earlier submission, that why these states are actually failing is the winner all take all system of democracy. First past the post. It has led to election violence because people do not have any other hope. Why? Because, but if you establish, if people know that even after electoral competition and contestations, there is still room for them in governance, a consocial arrangement, that is therefore what can actually, what can sustain democracy. So military coups that happen in
But
post-colonial
I think,
states.
moderator, with your permission, I think, Chris, we need to distinguish between democracy, tools for democracy, and the distortions. The distortions in Africa's democracy start with the approach. Of course, we have universal elections, universal suffrage in our elections. But what quality of elections do we have? It's a grand auction. It's a grand auction. If you rob the bank, come with bags of money, you can win any seat.
Yeah, you win election.
The second distortion is the abuse of state institutions, like the army and police in elections. So we need first take away the distortions before we make a conclusion that now this democracy is not real for Africa.
I am aware of all these distortions. And that is why I am saying, because let me tell you, do you know the conveyor belt of democracy is always liberal economic policies, liberal peace building paradigms? No, that is the conveyor belt. Because you see, there is, in Africa, by the way, there is an absence of a bottom-up democracy. That is why citizens are not part of all these democracy engagements you talk
Because
about.
of the distortions.
Yes, because of the distortions. And why? The reason is that you do not, those who spread the gospel of democracy do not look at citizens as partners to shape a democracy. They look at citizens as people who do not understand democracy and must be taught democracy. And that is why citizens have been a missing link. So sometimes even when you blame the citizens, they maybe think this is a foreign thing that they are not party to. They are just being taught and being enculturated into understanding its operations. That is why I would actually say that democratic engagement or democratic mobilization or state mobilization processes should look at citizens, look at entry points within citizens' engagement. Their social organization has an entry point to preach.
You are now talking of an approach.
Yes,
for
to
citizens
preach.
mobilization.
Yeah, to preach.
It has nothing to do with the principles of democracy.
No.
If I can come in briefly, those people you are asking to do that are using democracy instrumentally. It is an instrument for coming to power and remaining in power forever. So democracy to them, to those leaders, is not good in itself. It is just an instrument. They use it instrumentally
Keep power.
to come into power and keep power.
Yeah.
So how do you discourage them? The political will he was talking about. Can citizens through see this one? And the majority of the citizens may not be able to. But even the few citizens who are conscious, they are not engaged. They are just subjects. They just see things going wrong and they say, let things go wrong. Let me survive anyway. How do I survive, by the way? Me, I'm not going to talk. Mine is to survive. But if we don't think about a common good, most citizens in Africa, or subjects for that matter, have failed to engage in public affairs in order to bring about systems that can deliver public goods. We are now interested in private goods, and matters are made worse by that neoliberal Western market attitudes of private good and individualism. Can we think about public good, Ubuntu, and so that
maybe.
what happens to your neighbor can happen to you? There are very many Ugandans. Let's use an example. If there is cattle raids in Karamoja, or there are people starving there are those who don't mind. People are suffering in Kasese. There are those who you asked, they will not know what is happening in Kasese. There was a time when people in northern Uganda were suffering. People here in central Uganda,
no one cares.
We are saying, we just hear those things are taking place in the Guru. They have never gone to Guru. Let me tell you one incident. I became an external examiner for school practice in Chambogo. And the people who had done internal examination there were people from Guru. During the war, the insurgency actually, at the height of insurgency. And therefore you cannot go back as an external examiner or whatever. So they were looking for external examiners. People from the south refused. I said, let me go to Guru and see whether you will not come back. I went there, purposely to supervise, but also to see what is that thing they are talking about. Can we be concerned about the rest of Uganda rather than cocooning ourselves in our constituency? What is happening in my constituency? We need the public goods in society and stop selfishness.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Self-interest.
Chris, our time is
I think it is just fair. I think it is just fair.
Just in 30 seconds, please.
So what I was actually saying, I think Prof is actually not disagreeing with me. And maybe if I may rephrase so that I'm better understood.
Just in
is
30
that
seconds.
distortions of democracy is because of citizen alienation. We alienate citizens from democratic processes. We think our pedagogy of democracy is such that they do not know. We are the ones who know, so we need to teach them to know it.
Thank you.
Instead of looking at them as partners and their social engagements as entry points in advancing democratic causes.
Fair enough. Fantastic. Captain, we need to be out of this place. But I'll give you 2 minutes and the rest of us 1 minute, because I have a last question for you, which is Africa's resources its biggest disadvantage?
Yes, it is. And as long as we have those resources and we're not organized, there are people who are interested in them. And the more they keep
organized,
and the more they keep you disorganized, they will continue taking those resources. Now, let's get one point very clear. All these good things you people are talking about, these nice professors and whatnot, they are good. They can be done. Until you have a base on which this plant they are talking about can bloom, you will not have democracy. And therefore, we must go back to the roots. Let's look at our friends who have managed to get modern democracy. Where did it start? Where did democracy come into their countries? How did the democracy come in Britain, for example? How did democracy come into France? How did democracy come in the United States? They had a basis on which that democracy could bloom. Now, if you want Uganda, to all these good things you have talked about, for them to germinate and grow, you need to have a foundation set for this democracy to work. And that foundation is in our culture. How do we get the cultures of this country of ours to unite them and find a common value? Each culture in this country, starting with Bunyoro Kitara, all the way down. You were talking about Mporo a few minutes ago. All these kingdoms which were here,
Former Mporo.
all these Karamajongs, how can we get the common value that can unite us? We get a basis on which nice democracy can therefore work, in which we can get our people empowered, and therefore they can understand what democracy is all about. They can therefore create a Uganda democracy. We cannot continue living on liberal democracy and bringing examples which don't work here. We need now to say, wait a minute, how can we make this thing work in this country? How? Forget about these nasty people who have done wrong things, who use it as tools. They use Western democracy as tools, liberal democracy, Bretton Woods and whatever it is, using IMF to destroy us. Let us sit down and say, where is our country? What is our problem? And believe you me, the educated, the elite in this country, all of them are still guilty. Let's not only talk about politicians. Even the elite have got their weaknesses. They're actually living in a different world altogether compared to the rest of the country. So my view is that the elite plus the country, we should try and bring that country together so that we can have a platform on which this beautiful democracy they are talking about can work. And therefore, we get the ingredients of democracy and see how they can work with our values so that we grow it. And we should be patient. It will not grow in one day. It is something that we've got to build slowly, and we must, like he said, we must build those institutions that go with it on that mat that we have already set up. If we don't do that, no matter what you do, it will not work.
Thank you, Captain. Chris, your last words in 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think my statement on constitutional democracy was just misunderstood. And I think he has aptly put it well. Because elite, the intelligentsia, the elite in every community are very important aspects of democracy. So if we can create a buy-in, by the way, in Africa, you've seen even South Sudan falling. And by the way, just 3 days ago, South Sudan is, not South Sudan, Sudan. Sudan is not just in war, it is disintegrating because the Nuba Mountain recently inaugurated a government, meaning they are a full cabinet and they were even sworn in.
You have taken advantage
so
of,
what they are,
of the crisis.
yes, so what they're saying is that we are not part of that. So you see how constitutionalism is very important. Constitutionalism is a kind of engaging democracy.
Can I just give you some information? In the Nubian mountain, going that way, the kind of minerals they have is unbelievable. And there are people who are interested in that mineral. There are people who want to build an army base at the Red Sea. There are people who want the oil. So you have three groups that are behind that also.
Yeah, so now you look at these complex resource issues and social issues that can be arranged if our democracy is engages everyone, leaves no one behind. And that, for me, I think we should not look at constitutional democracy in Africa as an end. We should look at it as a process to achieve a more ideal democracy based on understanding of everyone, which is constitutional democracy. And I think, like Nkrumah said, seek first the political kingdom, and everything shall be readily availed. So once we address all these security questions, resource distribution, and all these other issues in Africa, then we can say Africa is economically liberated, and even the free trade area will work.
Thank you. Doctor.
It's very unfortunate that a continent, I think God spent a lot of time really creating Africa. There is no continent that is naturally endowed like Africa. Minerals, all, climate, fresh waters, energetic people, the most productive people. The 70% of 1.4 billion Africa's population are youth.
Doctor, have you heard of this mineral which is just been found in eastern Uganda, which is the
In
most highly sought about in the whole world?
Which one?
The one which makes telephones and whatnot?
Colton.
Colton?
No, Colton is even in
It's
my
even
home
in
area.
the-
No, there's one
Then
here
there is
now.
another one.
Eastern.
They call it
Yes.
rare earth mineral or something like
Yeah,
that.
that's
in
right.
Busoga.
That's right.
Every mineral resource is found in plenty.
That one is enough to run Uganda
In
for the next
Africa.
few years.
The fresh waters,
Assume we shall not fight over
the
it.
natural vegetation. So, when you look at how Africa really is endowed, it's very, very unfortunate to see that we have majority of the African people living in poverty. Very unfortunate to see that big proportions of our population cannot even afford basic health care, cannot afford 2 meals a day, with a beautiful climate.
Education.
The food insecurity, the education, a degradation of environment. Africa is in a crisis. We need to overhaul the complete leadership. Recently, when we were in Arusha, somebody from Burundi, I think, suggested that maybe since the deepest lake, Tanganyika is
One of the deepest in the
yes,
world.
in the world, that yes, is in Tanzania. How do we convince
And Burundi. Actually,
these
Bujumbura
leaders
is
On
a
the
port.
lake.
Is on the lake.
to get on a boat and around the deepest? So,
No,
but that is the
I thought he
unfortunate
was saying
bit.
we should throw all the African leaders into the lake.
Yes, exactly. That we should convince them to board the lake, the boat, and drown.
This is the cabinet.
So, and drown. So,
But even Lake Bunyonyi is deep.
yes. So that shows you the desperation of the African people. Leaders have let us down. 60 years is enough. Can the citizens rise? Can Africans rise and reclaim their continent and exploit their potential to the benefit of all the African people?
Thank you. Yes, Professor, you have the final words.
My final word is that the biggest challenge of Africa is not necessarily financial. The biggest problem of Africa is organizational, as even Captain Babu had talked about. We need to organize a functioning state. But to do that, our leaders and citizens must first appreciate that the African state is weak.
Yeah.
There are those which are failing, there are those which are fragile, there are those which are whatever description, prebendo or patronage, but we must appreciate that there is weak organization of the state in Africa. That's why policies are not implemented. Even the free continental Africa policy will not be implemented as long as the states are weak. Weak organization of that public authority to organize citizens. We lack public authorities that are functioning and sustainable. And we have to appreciate that we don't have them and aim at building them. By the way, even in Makerere University, there is a course called Organizational Studies,
Has it expired?
which I don't know when it is. The challenge with it is that people are not giving it the necessary resources because we do not appreciate that organization is very critical. So, to conclude, the African state is either failed or failing or weak. We appreciate that it is weak and rebuild the African state. And in turn, those African states will also strengthen the state, the transnational state of Africa in the AU, at AU headquarters in Addis Ababa, that will coordinate all these African approaches and schemes and plans and programs of having a free continental area of Africa. Unless we have strong states, even AU headquarters and secretariat will be weak. So my solution for Africa's problem today is a strong state, 2, a strong state, 3, a strong state.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Asante Sana. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you from Kampala Analytica, Chris, and of course, retired captain. Thank you for your time. Of course, to our viewers, it's always a pleasure making a date with you every Friday, 2 p.m. That is it. I don't want to add anything or spoil whatever has been said. You've heard it all. Have a lovely Friday. See you next week, same time.